Hello, welcome back. I hope you have successfully finished your Microsoft certification syllabus and have completed the exam. If not, please do practice well and complete the exam. As in the previous videos, we have understood the importance of modules along with working on several built-in modules. Now, let's know the importance of object-oriented programming approach by stepping our journey into objects and classes. As Python supports both structured as well as object-oriented programming paradigms, as a class contains data and methods that can access or manipulate data, because all values in Python such as lists, numbers, variables, functions, etc. are treated as objects. So, let's understand about types of variables inside a class and the features of object-oriented programming system in detail. So, till now we have understood how to create a module, how to work on some built-in modules. We have seen math module, random, system, OS, along with working on command line arguments. Now, let's enter into a very important approach of understanding object-oriented programming, because Python binds both the properties when we say procedure-oriented and when we say object-oriented programming. So, before diving into detail of it, let's first understand what is procedure-oriented and what is object-oriented programming, because these terms are very widely seen whenever you see any web programming languages you see, because when we say procedure-oriented programming languages, they are C, Pascal, Fortran. When you say object-oriented programming languages, the first thing you remember is Java, right? C++, Java, even Python follows both the properties. Okay, first let's understand about how does procedure-oriented programming has been implemented and what made scientists to run towards object-oriented programming approach. Okay, so for that I'll be taking a very good example and I'll be making you understand that concept. So I'll be opening my paint tool and I'll take a simple example of how does procedure oriented programming approach has been taken, because generally when you say procedure oriented programming approach, you make sure you use only the concept of functions, because functions are the primary building blocks of a program. That's where, even if you remember, if you have any idea of C programming, you only use main function, right? That's where people, even if you don't worry about, even if you don't have any knowledge of C programming, it's fine. But I just wanted to make sure that what do? You just divide this main function into multiple subtasks, right? That's where they make this as function 1 and you make this as function 2 and you make this as function 3. Because basically in procedure-oriented programming languages, while developing a software, the main task is divided into subtasks, right? So this is called as subtask 1, this is subtask 1, this is subtask 2, this is subtask 3, right? So that's where programmers or scientists, computer scientists, they have made sure that they develop the software and they make sure that they divide it into several subtasks, right? And each subtask is represented as a procedure or a function. So that is the reason the main task is composing of multiple procedures or multiple functionalities. So that is the reason the procedure is known as, you can generally call it as procedure oriented approach. That's where we call this approach where we make use of multiple functions, right? We make sure that we use this function, main function, to be divided into multiple tasks. That is the reason in C programming language, always you start with main function, right? You can just check in any browser, you can just see the same code, you just start with main function, right? That's where people started working on it. But basically, when you compare with the related approach, when you go from procedure oriented to object oriented programming, right? So when you go to object oriented programming, that's where, when I say object oriented programming, right, that's where you hear the term OOPS, right? object-oriented programming systems or object-oriented programming approach where C++, Java, Python they use, because everything here is in the format of where we use individual software objects where we use classes and objects, right? So before that we need to understand what is a class and what is an object, right? So generally you hear the word, right? A class is the blueprint for creating objects. What made this object-oriented programming approach differ from procedure-oriented programming approach? Yes, I'll be making it very simple, because a class is a module which itself contains data and other methods or functions, right? So to pictorially represent, what I'll do is I'll just make sure that it'll be easy for you. So I'll just cut this. Yeah. So in object-oriented programming approach, we generally make sure that we use. So I'll just make sure that, so you have divided this class with main method, because generally when you go for creation of classes and objects, always think in general terms. A class contains data and methods, right? Suppose we are all human beings, right? Every person is having different individuality, right? So my name is Saket and your name is Harish, and you have see everyone is an object, but we all belong to human beings class, right? Something like class will be generic in nature, whereas object will be specific. So here what I can do is this class with main task again, right? So what do? You can have this class 1 with data and methods, class 2, class 3. We have different classes. I can say this as class 1, class 2, class 3, right? So different data and different methods. So what happens here? The main task will be divided into several subtasks, and each class perform several interrelated tasks, right? But what made programmers, not only Python, what made programmers to shift from procedure-oriented approach to object-oriented programming approach? Because generally when I say objects, these exist physically in nature, right? When I say pigeon, sparrow, parrot, these are all birds, right? So they all belongs to bird class, right? So what made procedure-oriented approach to object-oriented programming? Because computer scientists, they wanted to feel something physically existing, right? That made programmers to shift to some existence of some things, because they wanted to have some new approach where they can build some new modules. Because when you go for procedure-oriented approach, if you have some debugging, if you have some mistake in one kind of approach, you need to rewrite or you need to check entire functionalities. But when you go for this object-oriented programming approach, you can just check individual class and you can just make modifications. That is the reason, due to procedure-oriented approach, where they should make sure that it will have some complex problems when the program is developed, where you need to handle bigger and more complex systems. That made people to shift into object-oriented programming approach, where it fails, where when you work on some bigger and complex systems, such as to create software to send satellites into the sky and control their operations from the ground systems, we may have to write millions of lines of code, right? So in such cases, you cannot create hundreds of functions, right? What do? You can make sure or you have all those functions inside a class, and that's where individuality happens. So that is the reason even Python has bounded both the approach, because when you write a function inside a class, that becomes a method. So even each module represents a class and the classes can be reusable. So always make sure that you think these classes are generic in nature, object is specific in nature. So for that, I have a very good example where you can see a kid, right? You can see this kid is having many behaviors, right? So whenever we see attributes and behaviors, because object will have mainly two characteristics. When I say attribute, that means his name, age, address, gender, email ID, mobile number, if he's young, right? Because they will be different, right? Because even name and age match, address we may not match, email ID will never ever match. So generally, when I go for object, it has mainly two characteristics, right? Attributes and behavior. So name, age, address will be my attribute. So behavior will be whether he can sing or dance or he can paint. So generally, in object-oriented programming concept, we focus on creating a reusable code where generally we create multiple objects. So when I say object, it can be a list, a tuple, set, whatever, whatnot, because Python follows both the approaches, whether it is procedure-oriented or object-oriented programming approach, both of them it will be followed. Because we say in Python, everything is represented as objects, whether it is list, tuple, set. That is the reason if you are good at writing functions, it is done. So you need not worry. So always remember, when you think of objects, just think in real terms. Every person is an object because they belong to a human being's class, right? So to make it more simple, I'll give you a very good example. So what you wanted to do, if you want to purchase a table, what do? You just go to online and you just purchase your table. That's a simple thing, right? You go to Pepperfry or any other site. But if you wanted to purchase by seeing it, what do? You go to the nearby furniture shop and you check the size and everything of it. But how does that table is prepared? It's a silly question, right? But think in carpenter point of view. So we want a table that is made by a carpenter who is well known to us. So what do? What does carpenter will do? He'll take up the measurements, right? He'll take up the length, breadth, height and color. Yes, so that's where we create a plan. So he also draw the picture. That is the reason a class is a blueprint of an object. That's where if you wanted to build a house, what does your father or mother will do? They ask the blueprint because that's where everything is happening in real life, and that made computer scientists to shift from procedure to some existence kind of thing. In the same way, if you wanted to purchase or if you wanted to buy a table, that carpenter will draw a picture and he gather the material. So here, this plan is called a class, and following that model, he'll prepare the table, right? That's where he gather the wood materials and all of those things. They consider them as a memory, and once the finest thing which is formed is called table. So that is an object. So in programming terminologies, we take variables, lists, tuple, print functions, everything is an object, and you declare inside them inside a class. So it is very simple. To make it more interesting, what do? We'll just go for the syntax of it, because generally I gave a pretty much definition here, because Python is object-oriented programming language where the main emphasis will be on creating objects only. So when you write a function inside a class, it is obviously called a method, right? So first let's go with the syntax of it. So what do? We just go for the practical approach. Enough of talking, right? So we'll go to our Python module and we just, Python ideally, and we'll write the syntax for it. I'll be just going to new file and I create this as just with some name. What do? We just give intro to object-oriented programming concept. First, we need to understand the syntax of class, right? Because you already understood the definition of how do we create a class, right? We have clearly seen what is the main difference between object-oriented programming language and procedure-oriented programming language. Now we'll understand the syntax of class. But before that, let's write some simple key points, right? Because that's where we are already doing it. So how do you do that? You always create a class. So I'll write it as a docstring, because writing docstring is very important. Just make it habituated for you. A class is created by using the keyword class. A class is always created by using the keyword class, whereas a class describes attributes and actions performed by its object. So that is the reason when I say objects, you have all this, whether it is a variable or methods, whatnot, you can take anything, because later we will be discussing about the properties of object-oriented programming, which is inheritance, polymorphism, everything. So you need not worry, but make sure that when you are relating the class method, it's very simple. You always think that in the format of, when you say class, you have attributes and actions, right? I have told you the example of a simple kid, right? His name, age, gender, all of them are attributes which identifies his characteristic. But his behavior, how does he talk, how does he dance, how does he spell, everything is considered over there. So we'll take that example and we'll just write a simple program without going into any methods of it. We'll just write a simple actions and attributes. So that's what my main intention here. So a class is created by using keyword class and describes actions and attributes and actions performed by its object. So always relate object to the physical existing part. Class may not be physically existing. It's a group of all objects, you can say, right? Performed by its, and it depends depending on our application point of view, because completely in Python web applications we mainly use object oriented programming concept only to make it dynamic, right? So what do? We write attributes or variables. So we write attributes or variables. When I say attributes, those are variables. And actions, what do you mean by actions? Actions are nothing but methods. What do you mean by method? As I told you, when we write a function inside a class, that is obviously a method. Or you can make it what's up to you, whether you take functions or methods, because a function inside a class, is called method. That's where you have the difference between a function and a method. So first let's see the syntax of a class. How do you create a class? Because we have here multiple functions, because we use the same def keyword. So syntax looks like this. How do we do it? Right, so let me just make it here. Syntax of class, we write the keyword. How do you declare? You declare the keyword class, and we have some naming conventions where how do we use this? Because class name need not be capital in Python, but generally to avoid the naming conventions, we write the class name as capital letter. When you habituate it, it is fine. Otherwise, you can just give, or you can also pass the object to it. So here, obviously mention the doc string, because doc string will give you the description. We'll be discussing some very special methods also, but this is the simple syntax. And what do you write? You write your statements here, right? We generally go for statements, but clearly we have some differentiation here. So when you declare a class, and it is pretty much different, because you have some methods over there. That is instance method, static method, where you generally start with a constructor, because when you're giving dot, you're getting some location of the files, right? You need not worry. So these are all statements. Or the other way is generally, this is another way where I just try to tell you the different syntax of it. You write class and you give the class name. You also pass the object here. That's not mandatory. It depends on user interest. How do we write? So always remember, when you give colon at the end, make sure you write doc string. That is what you are describing about the class. That means whether you are just making sure that it is a login page class or any kind, just always declare what is that doing. That is describing the class. So doc string is nothing but that is describing the class. And here go for defining the constructor, because I'll tell you what is a constructor and everything, but this is the basic syntax of class. So you declare, you initialize the objects, because we'll see a very simple difference of how do you create an object and everything. And there you go, you pass multiple methods here. So this is how a very simple approach of understanding the simple differences. So define method, and it goes on whether you create multiple methods here. This is, I just keep dot dot. Okay. Now what do we do is, we'll just create a very simple example. We'll just understand how do we create a simple class by just performing some person methods. I mean, we just create a simple class where we write attributes or variables and actions or functions, what I told in the above heading, right? So first let's write about a person. So I want to write some person details. So I just give this is a class, and we write class of, you just need to mention the name, right? I want to name the class name as person as it is. Now I will declare the doc string. So my doc string is, I just give this as simple demo. Now I declare the attributes here. So my attributes could be, I am trying to declare about the accents, I am trying to declare about the person details. Attributes means variables, something like name is equal to Saket. I just pass my name. It's up to you. You write your own names. Age 27. Because generally till now we have seen by defining a function. Here you are declaring a class and you write your statements here. Because I am just going in a very known way which we have already seen. Right? And then I create these actions. When I say actions, actions means functions. Right? So, but a class, when you write function inside a class, that becomes a method, because always you use the keyword called as def as it is. So define talk. I wanted to make sure that I declare a name talk. So always you need to pass some attribute here. When I say that thing, you just need to initialize that. We have so many things coming up with that. So I just give print of. I cannot directly give name. So I should just call with that attribute, or that's where constructor comes into picture, instance method and everything. You just pass the argument here. What are the two variables you gave? Name and age. So print of s.name, s.age. It's not class initialization or anything, right? You just need to pass an object. That's where we create an object to the class. So create an object to the class. That's how carpenter prepares table by making a plan, right? The table is our object over there. The plan which we create, that is a class. So when I save and when I execute this, you don't get anything, right? What you need to do? You need to make sure that you create an object. So I just create an object called as P. What is our class? So call the class, initialize the class here. You are just initializing the class because P is an object of person class, because object represents memory to store the actual data. So when you save and when you execute this, you get the result. So what you need to do here? What is your object over there? P. There you get the default special methods. What are the variables we have? Age, name and method is talk. So directly with that object, you need to make sure what is age. You get age is 27 and P dot. So directly access the variables and special methods within it. Name is Saket and P dot. What is the function? So the function is talk, but it is generally inside a class. So always give it as method. So that's how we access the special methods, and we'll understand what is double underscore in it, because these are all Python special naming conventions. We will not use them. Python internally uses it. So just simple example is how do you create a person class, because these are the variables and this is a function. We are creating an object to access all those variables and method or functions at a time. So that is the advantage of class, and we'll be understanding it in more detail, but just make it simple. You create a class because class is the blueprint for an object. When I say object, it can be a variable, method, list, tuple, anything. This is a very simple example. So just keep practicing on it. It will be very much easy.